Alright, I'm coming to you from Derby in Tasmania on holiday today, and we're going to be painting a piece or a loaf of sourdough bread. You can see that I have a loaf here that we were gifted by our hosts, our accommodation hosts, and so I was feeling really inspired, and Will suggested that I paint the bread, and I thought it was a great idea. So there might be a few different sounds today than normal. There's the sound of the crackling fire. I think I just heard a motorbike go past, and you might even hear Will turning the pages of his book as he's reading in the other room. And so I will also talk you through briefly my materials. I've got a folding metal palette for my paints. So I've got my little paints in here, and I've mixed up some colours already in these wells ready to go. And I'm using a size 6 down, size 6 round brush today. And what else have I got? I've got some jars of water and my watercolour paper. And so let's get started. This will take a couple of layers of paint. So our first layer that we're going to put down is, of course, our base layer, and I'm grabbing some of this lovely yellowy brown. It's a very, very, very warm yellow. I'm going to be using some really big brush strokes to get some paint onto the page. So I want this layer to be really lovely and light and quite diluted paint. So I'm just creating the shape of my loaf of bread, which, as you'll know, I'm sure, sourdough bread isn't often perfectly shaped. It's got lumps and bumps and all that good stuff. So it's absolutely fine and encouraged, as always, if your painting has lots of lumps and bumps as well. So I'm just getting my shape down. Might add another little bit of a bump over here. Let's make my bread a little bit longer. I'm trying not to move the paint around too much once it's actually on the page, just sort of letting it flow and settle where it wants to. And I'm dabbing in a little bit more paint, and I'm also going to dab in a little bit of a darker brown to add a bit of shadow and depth, and using our wet on wet technique to do that. So I'm just dabbing the wet paint onto the wet paint or wet page, and just dabbing in a few other darker bits. But I'm not adding any real detail or anything yet. I'm just getting this base layer down to get the colours that I sort of see when I look at the bread, getting them onto the page, adding a little bit of variety, but not too dark, because we'll come in and add some more detail once this is completely dry. So that's our first layer done, basically a bread coloured blob on our page, and we'll let this dry completely and come back and add some more detail. Okay, so our loaf of bread should be lovely and dry. I actually left mine overnight, and at this stage it looks a bit like a potato, but we're going to add in some more detail using wet on dry technique. So I'm going to grab my size 6 round brush. I've actually got a size 4 round brush ready here as well, in case I need something a bit smaller for smaller details. And I'm going to grab my warm orangey brown onto my brush and just grab a teeny bit more water onto my brush as well to dilute the paint a little bit. So I'm not sure if you could see that, but I just dipped my brush with paint on it into my water jar just to grab a bit of water and dilute it a little more. But I also did brush, I guess I dragged the end of the brush along the water jar as well, so that I didn't have huge amounts of water on the brush. Alright, so I'm working across my, I keep going to call it a potato, my loaf of bread, using this diluted colour, which is basically the same colour as the base colour of our loaf of bread, but it's just a little bit more concentrated and a little bit brighter than our base layer, so that we're adding a bit of depth and detail. So you'll see that I'm creating a kind of cross shape in the top of my loaf of bread, and that's because the loaf of bread that I'm actually painting has that shape in it, kind of. I'm just doing a very loose representation. So I'm putting in my cross. So the way that I'm doing that is actually that I'm painting around the outside of the loaf of bread, and I'm working quite quickly so that the paint is still wet and I can dab in some more colour. But what I'm doing is, instead of painting the cross onto the bread, I'm actually painting around it and then letting the cross shine through as a highlight instead. And now I'm dabbing in some of my darker paint into the tips of the bread here, just to add a bit more depth, and because the sourdough loaf that I'm looking at is looking a little browner there. Alright, so I'm dabbing that in, and you'll see that because I was working with this layer of paint that we've just popped on, it was still wet, so I was able to dab in more paint and then use the wet in wet technique and let the paint do its beautiful watercolour thing and just, I guess, bleed and spread through the rest of the paint. Now what I'm going to do is grab some more of this darker colour, dilute it on my brush a bit more, and then just sort of dab it in little bits and pieces around my bread where I see that there are darker patches. Oh, the birds outside the window are tweeting now. So I'm going to dab in a few little bits and pieces like that, just to add a bit of interest. And if you're looking at a loaf of bread or a photo of a loaf of bread, particularly if it's a sourdough or something like that, you'll see that there are imperfections and there's lots of variation in colour. So I'm trying to really capture that. I'm grabbing some more of my base layer colour, but nice and concentrated on my brush, and also dabbing that in too to add a bit more depth and detail. And I'm going to dab a little more down here while it's still wet to make it a bit darker and make a bit more of a shadow effect. But this layer of paint is starting to dry, so it's not going to bleed and spread quite as much as it would have earlier. And so you'll see that we've left this as a highlight here by simply not painting that area and letting the paint below shine through, which is a really, really cool effect with watercolour. And I really love doing it. And it's sort of just, I guess you kind of just have to think a little bit before you start painting. Think about where you might like to have something really bright and light shining through your painting, and then think about how you can leave that area blank and paint around it to create that highlight, rather than trying to paint something light over the top, which I guess you might do with another medium like acrylic or something. So I'm going to let my bread dry, and I'm probably going to come back in with another layer once it's completely dry, just to add a few more details and a little bit of shadow. Okay, our bread should be completely dry once again, and we're going to come in with some details one last time. So I'm using a size 4 round brush, and I've got the same 2 browns mixed up from earlier, and I also have a little bit of white paint, which I'll tag the one that I'm using below. And I'm just going to use my size 4 round brush to add in some shadow, detail and depth. So you'll see that I use a range of brush strokes and also just some little dots and things like that. And the main thing is to be loose and free and messy and not too worried about being overly precise or anything like that. So let's get started with the final layer on our sourdough bread. So using just the tip of the brush, I'm actually adding in a little bit more detail on these points on the bread and also around these edges. So just using a range of brush strokes, using mostly just the tip of the brush. Alright, you'll see that I've added in some little teeny tiny white highlights using just the tip of my brush to add in some little dots. And I also added a bit more detail in this sort of cross part of our loaf of bread, but I had to be really careful that I wasn't touching any wet paint from the outside, otherwise they would bleed together and just create a sort of blob and you'd have no detail here. So just be aware of that if you add any more detail in the middle, that it doesn't touch any wet paint on the outside. And I also put in some shadow down here, and I'm just popping in a few more little teeny tiny highlights. And I think to really create a lovely sort of shadow effect, I need to, I guess what I want to do is to make this loaf of bread look less like it's just sort of sitting on top of the page and make it look sort of more at home. So I'm going to paint a little bit of a shadow using actually the same darker grayish brown that I used before on the loaf of bread itself. And it's going to be really diluted, and I'm using my larger brush, and I'm just going to put a bit of shadow on the page over here. So I'm blending the edges of the shadow using some water, and I might actually have it sort of almost working as a bit of a background in the whole way around the loaf of bread. So I've used a colour that I used in the actual loaf of bread painting itself to really, I guess, use the same palette, the same colour scheme and everything. And then I'm going to blend these edges just with a bit of water on my paintbrush to create those really soft, lovely edges rather than a really harsh edge. So if you're painting a shadow and you're thinking, oh, like it's sort of maybe looking a little bit cartoonish or something like that, then if you grab some water on your brush while the shadow is still wet and just with just clear water, just blending it around the edges like this, it helps a lot. And I'm just going to dab in a little bit more of the darker paint in here underneath the loaf of bread. And there we go, a really lovely, delicious loaf of sourdough bread. And if that doesn't make you hungry, I don't know what will. So don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss a new tutorial. I have new videos coming out every single Tuesday, and tag me on Instagram in anything that you paint that's inspired by one of my videos. I'm at Ruby Tuesday Art.